welcome everybody to the Effects of Fire on Cultural Resources webinar. I see from the list of people signed up that I've got some friends out there, some I haven't seen for quite a while, and also some of the co-authors of some of the chapters in the volume. For those of you who haven't been to Missoula, the picture on the first frame there is Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, and that has been my professional home for the last 33 years, and I will be retaining an office there, but I will be moving to the private sector after the first of the year. And so I do hope to be working with you folks in the future, but in a somewhat different capacity. So now I have to learn the technology here, and that's I'm technologically challenged. As Xander indicated, kind of the impetus for this webinar is the recently published synthesis on the effects of fire on cultural resources. A little bit of history about that. For a number of years, I was involved in a course down at the Western Archaeological Conservation Center in Tucson, Park Service research facility down there, and we taught a course where pairs of people came in from the different Park Service units, one from the fire management side and one from the cultural resource side. And the goal of that training course was to increase the awareness of the fire community of the cultural resource issues, and to increase the awareness of the cultural resource specialists on fire issues. And basically the goal was to get them to be more aware of each other's disciplines, to improve the level of collaboration and discourse. And so basically what we put together was a primer on the effects of fire on archaeological cultural resources. And in that training session, basically my role was to give the cultural resource people a primer on fire. So as you look at the volume, there's 224 pages, 9 chapters, 15 authors, and a nice glossary in there. You know, you'll see that it goes through chapter by chapter, covering different resources. And I want to just kind of quickly today give just a real thumbnail synopsis of what's in the volume. I encourage you to get a copy and read it and begin to use it. And there on the bottom of this slide, there's, if I can get the technology, you can order it electronically there, and then on the last slide there'll actually be a place where you can actually order a hard copy. And for a couple of co-authors out there, I finally got boxes, and I plan on sending you your own copies. All right, so Chapter 1 is kind of introduction. Myself, Cassandra Conner, Christine Lee, and Nelson Siefken, Park Service archaeologists, who I'm sure many of you know, authored that. And you know, being an introduction, basically, it sets the stage for why the volume was written in the first place, and what to expect in the volume. Purpose of the synthesis is provide the cultural resource people with fire effects basics, to provide the fire managers with the cultural resource basics, and to facilitate this interdisciplinary planning and implementation, and to minimize interdisciplinary conflicts. One of the interesting things that happened in teaching this course was we had a number of SHPOs come to the course, interested to learn more about fire, and really was an eye-opener for me to really understand better how the laws and policies play out, as a typical fire dog, it's kind of nose to the fire line is the way I kind of grew up in the business, and certainly one of the things I want my fire colleagues to do is to increase the level of sensitivity that they have when they're working out there. Kind of open your eyes and really think about the site and the situation in the context. We always talk about situational awareness in fire, and be aware of the situation around you, and if things look out of place, like if a stone or something there doesn't look like it's natural, you might think about whether or not it may have a cultural resource value. So one of the things I hope the volume does is give some examples that will improve the level of knowledge and sensitivity on the part of my fire colleagues. So, with that in mind, I know that all the CR specialists could do a far better job of this portion of the presentation than I could, but keeping in mind that I want to elevate the knowledge of the fire community, just give a few examples of cultural resources. Obviously, we all recognize cliff dwellings and things like that as cultural resources, but they can be any type of artifact left by historic and prehistoric peoples, sites of habitation, extended use, tool-making sites, things like this. And landscapes are often very important in traditions. Basically, if it's a prominent feature or a very productive site or a travel corridor, there's a good bet that it has some cultural significance, and so it's something that we need to be more sensitive to as we do our fire and fuels work. So this next slide is just an example. This happens to be an Indian scarred tree in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area. My colleague Bob Keene there for scale. That's just one example of dozens or maybe even hundreds of different types of artifacts and cultural resources that you might encounter in your daily work. So why are cultural resources an important issue in fire management? I think we can all agree that it's ethical to protect and preserve the resources for current and future generations. It's the law, obviously, to do that. And there's many ways in which fire and fire management can damage cultural resources. And so the goal is to minimize and mitigate any cultural resource conflicts associated with fuels treatment, restoration, fire suppression, and rehabilitation work. Kind of the bottom line is it's ethical, it's professional, and we are fire professionals, and it's the law. And so it needs to be an integral part of our job. This next slide, a lot of verbiage on it, and I don't expect everybody to read it right now, but I want to kind of set the stage a little bit. It's always good to start with some terminology and kind of partition any complex problem into some simpler subcomponents so you can kind of approach them in a logical way. And so I'll start kind of in reverse order with the third order effects. Basically, the third order effects of fire are the human effects, how it affects people and their feelings, and how people respond. So it deals with actions and feelings, and examples of tangible activities that people do: suppression, rehabilitation, mitigation, looting, vandalism, changes in hunting and gathering patterns. Those would all be examples of tangible activities. But more importantly, oftentimes, and more difficult to quantify, are the intangible human values. The value that people put on a sense of place, and how it factors into their identity of who they are and their cultural experience. And I kind of wanted to start with third order effects first, because I think the bottom line is that ultimately it is the human effects that are most important. Counting backwards down to second-order effects, basically second-order effects are the biophysical effects that result from post-fire events, storms, rain, things like this. These effects would occur in the absence of any type of human intervention, but they can be very important effects. Part of the reason for distinguishing between first and second order effects is the models that are available and the skills that are needed to understand and predict and manage second order effects. But in terms of archaeology, probably the biggest second order effect is erosion. Erosion many times can cause more damage than the actual fire itself caused to the cultural resource. And then last, or first, the direct first-order effects of fire. Those are the things that fire actually does. Fire is basically a fairly simple chemical process. It's rapid oxidation. It releases chemicals, smoke, soot, ash, and it releases energy. And the energy has the potential to change things in the ecosystem and to change the cultural resources. And that's primarily where I fit into this interdisciplinary activity of effects of fire on cultural resources. And so I've spent the bulk of my time focused on the rather bland science aspects of, heat transfer and material properties and things like this that are important for understanding what actually happens. But I want to reemphasize what is really important, and that is how it affects people. So I'll spend a little time just quickly going through and giving a sense of what's in the chapters, and then I'll come back and spend a little bit more time on the second order effects. So chapter 2, myself and Cassandra Conner, the authors of that chapter, and basically all the fire people would recognize obviously the symbology of the fire triangle. One of the things we talk about in chapter 2 is the different scales at which fire affects cultural resources. Fire affects it both in short-term small spatial scales and in long-term landscape scales. The direct effects predominantly occur at this fine spatial scale. Basically, one of the take-home messages is that it's the fire in direct proximity to where an artifact or a cultural site actually is that are the dominant factors affecting the change that will occur to that resource or that site. Chapter 3 is a chapter on prehistoric ceramics by Tricia Rude and Trenkle Jones. There's some examples of some ceramics. There are places in the Southwest where the ground is literally littered with pottery shards, and fire people, when you see pottery shards on the ground, you're on a site. You know that you need to take extra care to redouble your light on the land suppression activities, and it's probably a good time to contact a CR resource specialist if you don't already have one that you're working with. Chapter 4 is a really great chapter on lithics, or rocks to those of us that are less gifted terminologically. I would have, prior to working with the archaeologists, probably picked up a stone like that myself and put it in my hand and possibly even chunked it at something. But in the course of teaching this course, I've come to respect that if that stone doesn't look like the geology, which in this particular case it does not, if I see that kind of stone in the stream bottom where it's been rolled over by the river, it looks in place. But when it's on the side of a hill slope in another geologic formation, it no longer looks like a rock to me. And so Krista gives a number of really excellent examples of different effects of fire on the various lithics or stone materials that were used by Native Americans. This being an example of an obsidian flake where it received some sooting, possibly some thermal change, not possible to actually tell that just by looking. This next is an example of obsidian on the left where it's not been heated, and clearly on the right where it was heated to 800 degrees C, and obviously a substantial change. For my fire colleagues, one of the interesting things I've learned in the process of this about obsidian is you can tell where the obsidian came from. So, for example, they've found Yellowstone obsidian in tools and sites in Indiana and Ohio. And that gives the archaeologist a tremendous amount of information about trade and things like that in prehistoric times. So it's a material that was extremely valuable for spears, arrows, arrowheads, scrapers, knives, and it's metaphorically, maybe we could say one of the charismatic megafauna of the lithics archaeology world because of the tremendous amount of information that it can carry. Another stone tool making material, chert. This slide just illustrates some of the effects. The mineralogy of rocks is such that they're not generally uniform substances, and differential, as a heat pulse penetrates a rock, the differential expansion and contraction of materials causes stresses to build up, which actually shatter the material. And I'll show another example of that a little bit further along. So, like I said, when you're out there in the field and you see a stone like this, look at the geology, look at the situation, and ask yourself if that looks like it got there by a natural process. Think about it before you move it, because in fact it may have some cultural significance. Some of the diagnostic techniques available to cultural resource specialists can at times help them to figure out what the stone actually ground, for example. And hopefully I'm not raising too many eyebrows of my cultural resource colleagues. But Chapter 5, chapter on rock art by Roger Kelly and Daniel McCarthy. Just an example here of a site in Utah where wildfire caused exfoliation of rock art on a rock face. But there are lots of other examples out there, pictographs, petroglyphs, and some large landscape features. So, in your fire management activities, if you notice that one large figure, that there's some tire tracks going through there. We would not want that to be tracks from our fire trucks. So just another example of a type of resource that one might encounter out there. Charlie Hecker's written a nice chapter on materials from the historic period. As I understand it, historic period really refers to when writing actually became common in an area. So I think Mexico, that's around 1540, probably a little bit later in other parts of North America. But it's a period where there were chroniclers there writing about events, and essentially anything from the historic period up to as recent as 50 years ago could, under the National Historic Preservation Act, be a cultural resource. And so a lot of the sites that we might consider to be old dumps and junks when we're out there might actually have a story to tell, and should be treated respectfully. Chapter 7, Elizabeth Oster, Samantha Rascovich Barge, and Michael Elliott. Interesting chapter based on a lot of the work that they did down in the Southwest, and particularly in the Bandelier National Monument area. A lot of these cultural sites were not forested when they were in intensive utilization, but they're forested now. Trees have grown up, died. There's stumps, roots, rotten stumps that sometimes penetrate down into cultural resources, and they have the potential to carry fire to deeper levels and to impact wood, pollen, other organic materials that might have been buried in the site. Chapter 8, John Welch, for me an inspirational chapter, really brings home to me the importance of the human element, and it's part of the reason why I tried to stress it in that earlier figure. These landscapes and sites have long history and deep history with a lot of people. And they're not just the woods, they are a place. And if it's, a beautiful vista or a productive site, things like that, it probably has a cultural history, and it probably has a lot of people that care about the management of that activity and want to be informed, involved, and part of management decisions. Okay, so we got a small delay while we switch.
I switched it over for you. You're all set.
It's not hot. I'm clicking on it and nothing's happening.
You're on chapter 9 now, right?
It's not advancing. I can still go back. I'm not able to advance, Xander.
Okay, well, let's see. You start talking about chapter 9, and I can advance it for you if you'd like.
Okay. Chapter 9 is implications of management on cultural resources by Becky Timmons, Lynn DeBano, and myself. It includes a conceptual model of the planning process and where monitoring and consultation fit into the planning process, and identifies some of the tools that are available to help with the planning. And it gives a number of examples. I'm no longer live here, so you're going to have to switch slides for me.
Are you looking at the right screen here? I've got the, for example, fire management slide up now.
It's not. Mine is still stuck on 8.
All right. Well,
I don't know.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'm the only one seeing this change.
Is it changing for other people?
No, apparently not.
how about if I give you maybe a couple of seconds to see if that can be resolved? There, now I've got the 9 up.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know.
And I don't have the controls at the top.
Okay, let's try that. Do you have them now?
I do. All right, I think we're back online. Okay, good.
Hi, everybody.
Okay. So Chapter 9 shows a number of examples of different types of effects. The site down in the Bugaboo Fire there in the Okefenokee, a very important archaeological site. It was known about and cataloged by the archaeologist, but it was not known and cataloged by the person driving that tractor plow. And just to kind of stress the real need, for all parties to come together and try to communicate as best we can. Those pottery shards that are shown there were, found in basically in the tractor line. The line could have been moved, a few yards one way or the other and completely missed the site. Another example would not have been quite so obvious to the dozer operator coming down the line on the 88 fire, Highway 88 fire in California, but this is an example where, if you understand the resource and the geology, a lot of oak and a lot of bedrock mortars common in this area, and in one could probably anticipate some of these effects might occur with some type of advance warning. So in a case like this, particularly important, like an initial attack, but that was a cultural resource damaged by a dozer blade. All right, I'll just kind of go back and hit a little bit more on some of the first order fire effects. Probably review and redundant to a lot of my fire colleagues, but I'd encourage you to read the chapter 2 over, just so that you have a better understanding if your cultural resource specialist comes and talks to you about fire effects and some of the models that you might invoke in terms of developing prescriptions to minimize effects, or even working in suppression or rehabilitation modes. So some of the factors to consider when predicting first order fire effects, certainly the material type, whether it's a stone, ceramic, leather, bone, etc. I'll show a graph with a chart of some of the thermal effects here in a minute. But the material location, whether a material is either above the ground exposed, lying on the surface exposed, or whether or not it's buried either beneath humus or mineral soil. The fire behavior characteristics, the fire line intensity, flame length relationships are important to things that are above ground and exposed, or things that are exposed laying on the surface. The duration and depth of burn are more important to fire effects at depth in the soil. And the heat transfer mechanisms associated with how the energy is going to be transferred from that combustion zone to the cultural resource. All critical factors in controlling those first order effects. So what are some of the effects that might be observed? Might affect the dendrochronology. For example, if it's a tree and it has fire scar information, or if it has blaze marks or things like this, that it might have been autographed by a famous person, and dating of those things can be lost. Paleobotanical materials can be altered by the heat from the fire. Probably can also be altered by some of the chemicals released by the fire. Radiocarbon dating, archaeomagnetic dating, and dating techniques for figuring out when sites were occupied, when artifacts were manufactured. Thermoluminescence. One of my favorites is the obsidian hydration. I'll show an example of that here. And physical damage, such as the pot lidding and shattering that I previously showed. Basically, this just shows what happens with obsidian dating. As the cultural folks know, obsidian, when you chip it, begins to absorb moisture from the atmosphere or the surroundings, and it forms a hydration band, and the rate at which that occurs is fairly constant, so it gives one a mechanism to date when an artifact was created, and that dating process can be lost or confused by heat from a fire. One of the factors that's important is time-temperature relationship. This happens to be some examples for some different lithic materials, stone materials. But basically, you know, if you are below a certain threshold of time and temperature, you would expect no damage to occur. If you're above that threshold, you would expect some type of damage to occur. However, damage might be defined in that particular case. But there's limitations to that. I may be able to kill plant tissue by an hour at 50 degrees C or a second at 70 degrees C, for example, and similar relationships for other types of materials. But in the case of a lot of materials, and particularly stone materials, the differential heating sets up stresses in the material such that rapid heating or rapid cooling from retardants or fire hoses and things like that can cause thermal shock and basically shatter the material. So this is an example of spalling, natural process of weathering that goes on and has gone on from time immemorial in fires, and would only be of concern if this happened to be a cultural site. If this was a site of active tool making, for example, then there could be information lost. But that's an example of spalling. This is an example of spalling on some rock art. And those differential heating rates and the stress causing exfoliation of the surface of the material and losing the rock art in this case. So what kinds of things are important to consider in terms of damage to rock art, for example? Radiation is energy being transferred at a distance, and it decreases approximately with the square of the distance. Geometry can affect that somewhat, but as you can see, there's a substantial difference between the distance with a 66-foot high flame and the distance with a 3-foot high flame. So this can give you some guidance, for example, as to how far back from a rock art site one might be wanting to treat fuels in order to reduce the fire line intensity and minimize the potential for damaging a resource from a wildfire or a prescribed fire, as the case may be. This just happens to be an example from a controlled field test where we salted a site with some cultural resources that basically no longer had any interpretive value. This happens to be a picture from the actual fire as it was sweeping over that spot. We have some neat cameras that survived being inside burns. the energy on that early spring sagebrush grass fire on the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest was almost as high as we'd measured in coniferous crown fires, the maximum, but the duration of the heating was less. But just to illustrate, this was the site before, and a lot of fine fuels right here at the site. You can see by the character in the post-burn that this fire burned a very short duration, didn't even completely char a piece of that sagebrush there, but the rapid heating of the rock caused enough stress to build up in the rock that it shattered the chert. And you can see that it actually shattered the chert after the passage of the flame front because the grasses aren't even charred beneath the rock. So one of the principles that I kind of try to focus on when developing prescriptions and evaluating the potential for fire to affect a cultural resource is to look at two dimensions of fire severity. And there's some really interesting and excellent scientific work going on right now in defining fire severity more rigorously and coming up with new metrics of fire severity. And that's great work, but it's not quite ready, if you will, for prime time, for field use in everyday work, and particularly by people who don't have a lot of instrumentation and analysis budgets and things like that. So the focus, here is the flame length or intensity of the fire, and it's being driven by primarily by the mass of fine fuels that are out there and by short-term weather. Principally, the relative humidity over the last few hours and the wind are going to be the dominant drivers of the flame length of that fire. And as I said, that flame length, that dictates the amount of radiation being emitted to the surface of a rock art or an artifact on the ground, and roughly speaking, above about 3 feet thick. The flame is already emitting its maximum. So if a flame is 30 feet thick, it's not going to emit more radiation to a surface than one that's 10 feet thick. And so I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind. The depth of burn is critical for anything that's actually insulated from that radiation load. So this just happens to be an example of what I would call, for metaphorical reasons, a cool short duration fire. A fire scientist would chafe at the use of the term cool, but in a layman's sense, it's a cool short duration fire. This being an example of a grass fire, low intensity, light depth of burn, effects to things that are close to the ground, but not things that are very far above the ground. This would be an example of a crown fire burning over either bare mineral soil or over wet duff, where the fire passes by very quickly. A crown fire typically is going to reside over a spot on the order of about 30 to 80 seconds, and then it's moved on. It's already consumed all of that fine fuel and is now in the cool down phase. And so that longer term heating is going to be more a function of the heavy branch wood, and the coarse woody debris, and the duff, and whether or not it does or doesn't burn. So in this case, light depth of burn, that would be associated with duff that was too wet to burn. This would be an example of a slow creeping ground fire in deep forest humus. It may have flames on the order of 2-3 inches. and may sit there and burn for up to 30 hours, and in some cases in deep organic soils even longer than that. So you might have durations of burning anywhere from 3 to 30 hours, but very minimal effect to anything that is more than a few inches above the ground, but a major effect to anything below ground, or potentially, I should say. That would be a function of the depth below the ground. And then this would be the worst case scenario, where you had a crown fire that occurred, and then it was followed up by a deep burning ground fire where you had several hours of heating at the site, at a point on the landscape. So the depth of burn is reasonably predictable if you've got some input. In this case, this is the moisture content that you might measure if you were sampling and monitoring your duff moisture. The gray area gives you the typical range, and basically I've broken it into low, medium, and deep depth of burn. If you've got moisture contents less than 50%, you can pretty well be assured that if the duff is deep enough to burn, that it will substantially burn out, and you'll have a significant heat pulse into the site. Duff less than about 4 centimeters deep does not burn very well, independent of being driven by that flaming in the surface fuels. And duff that's very wet typically will not burn well, even if there's a sustained burning in logs. Can occur, but it's somewhat unusual. You can use the National Fire Danger Rating System for your planning purposes to try to get an idea of when you might conduct a prescribed burn where you would expect to have lesser versus greater effects. This is an example of some temperature thresholds on the top, some temperature thresholds for typical effects on nutrients and things like that in the soils, or plant tissues, for example, in the typically 40 to 70, more commonly in the 50 to 60 degrees centigrade range is where most temperature effects on plants are going to occur. And in the lower one, some temperature ranges from the literature for different effects on cultural resources. So one can take a little bit of what they know about the fire situation and actually begin to project what to expect from a fire, whether it's a prescribed fire or if one is looking at post-fire monitoring, for example. So this top line is a crown fire over bare mineral soil. You can see that it reaches a higher temperature, 800 degrees in this case, near the surface, drops off very rapidly because of the short duration of that crown fire. In contrast, 5 centimeters, 15 centimeters, and 25 centimeter depth of duff, and the differential heating associated with the burnout of those deeper organic layers. If you were concerned, for example, about the depth at which a non-wettable layer might form in the soil, you'd pick a number like about 240 degrees, and you'd predict it to occur at different depths based on the different fire situations. You can get these predictions from the first order fire effects model soil heating module. So I mentioned previously the second order effect of erosion. The situation that's going to give you the greatest potential for erosion is that worst case scenario where you had an intense surface or crown fire that removed overstory foliage. You know, so now you've got nothing intercepting rainfall from above, and you've also had the maximum heat pulse down into the soil. You can begin to predict what to expect if you use the first order fire effects model as to where you would be on the depth of burn And if you use Behave, Farsight, and a FLAM map, you can begin to refine your expectations of what type of heat load to expect above ground. So basically, I think that there is a reasonable scientific basis for predicting the potential impact of fire management activities on cultural resources. And I think the interdisciplinary synthesis and integration can be, will facilitate planning and implementation of activities that pose minimal threats to the cultural resources. And with that, I've at least allowed a couple of minutes for some questions, and I'd be more than happy to stay on for a few minutes longer and be more than happy to dialogue with any of you folks now or later. I did mention that I'm going to be retiring here shortly and moving over to the private sector, but I still have fire in my belly, metaphorically speaking, and hope to be active and engaged. And I personally have really enjoyed this portion of my career working on fire and cultural resources. It's been a very interesting learning experience for me. So, with Xander, I'll turn that over to you and questions.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Kevin. That was a great presentation. Really nice overview of all that can be found in this new guide. Well, let's jump right into questions here. And just as a note, the webinar won't shut off exactly at 1, so if you can stick around, please do. If you got to go, we understand that as well. So the first question came in from J.R. Walsh, and he says that he's been away from Bayer and hotlines for about 7 years, and he asks if cultural resources are getting more and better attention in fuels management and planning and suppression. And he's particularly concerned about the apparent variation in commitment levels in Type 1 teams. Can you comment on that, Kevin?
It's a fact, all right? Not all Type 1 teams are created equal. They don't come with the same mix of skills across the board. I mean, quite frankly, one of the goals of this volume is to raise the bar for all of our fire people. And if we raise the bar at all for some, then my efforts have been well worth it. But hold all of the professionals that you work with to their professionalism. And if you aren't getting the support and attention, that you think you need, don't hesitate to step forward and verbalize that in an open, professional way. Good luck with it. I can tell you, I started on the Angeles in 1970. And we probably would have delighted in damaging a cultural resource. I don't say that seriously, but we were so oblivious to those other issues. I've seen tremendous improvements in my career, and that gives me great hope for continued improvement into the future.
And let me ask, he's got a follow-on here, and do you see, what do you see as the key research issues at that fire cultural resources interface? What are the next steps that people need to be focusing on?
I tend personally to get more involved in just kind of the nuts and bolts research of heat transfer, material properties, better predictive models. To be honest, I think that we need to do better in the social science side of fire management. And while that's not my particular discipline, you can look at my career and see that, I think if I had to come down on balance one way or the other, I would probably say that the human dimension side, how decisions are made, how people factor information into decisions, how can we do a better job to actually get all of the relevant cultural resource information to the table for decisions.
All right, well, there's another question that came in that maybe is more on that nuts and bolts side, and Warren asked about the impacts and effects of fire retardant on cultural resources. Is that something you'd comment on, Kevin?
There are some examples in the book. I think, as I recall, well, not all the examples came from Mesa Verde, but certainly there's a lot of experience with from Mesa Verde, where they had to do a lot of restoration following the Long Mesa fire and other fires that they've had there. I would really recommend that the individual asking the question send me an email so that I can actually give that individual a couple of contact people to follow up with that really would be better to answer that question. I'm not aware of any actual active research going on, but I know that there was recently a national review team looking at retardants, and I can't give you off the top of my head the contact information. The person leading the team, as I recall, is in Salt Lake City. But if the person will email me at kryan@fs.fed.us, I will try to yard that up and get that back to you, and maybe even pass that on to you, Xander, if you want to post that on the website.
Sure, I can do that. There's a comment from Christy Bullock that people can read in the chat window about the importance of getting cultural resource specialists involved on fire teams, and I'll let folks read that. There's a question about whether the new synthesis gives information about the laws, et cetera, in place to protect cultural resources. So is that something that the volume covers, Kevin?
The volume does cover that lightly, okay? In other words, the laws are explicitly mentioned in Chapter 1 as part of the foundation for, why this is an important issue. In my own personal experience, I've gone from those names and just Googled them and found a treasure trove of information about the laws and their interpretation. That would probably be the first way to jump in, but the CR specialist in your particular area probably could really give any fire person a good primer on the relevance of the various laws and how they're interpreted. There's a lot of agency guidelines out there.
And now I'm going to unmute the phone line so if folks have other questions, they can just say them out loud. So if you've got something going on in the background, mute your own phone or hang up. Hopefully we won't have too more. I see that. Oh, maybe there's too much. Other questions out there? Okay, so I guess we're getting close to our 1 o'clock end time, and we can keep answering a few more questions here. I did want to mention briefly that the Joint Fire Science Program has recently funded a project entitled Linking Field-Based and Experimental Methods to Quantify, Predict, and Manage Fire Effects on Cultural Resources. And within the team, we're calling this project ArcBurn because it's a shorter title. And it's a collaborative effort from some U.S. Forest Service scientists, Rachel Lohman, Brett Butler, Jim Reardon, Jennifer Dyer, folks at the Valles Caldera Trust, Anna Steffen, Jamie Savito, and myself to quantify the fire behaviors that cause damage to archaeological resource, synthesize existing information on fire effects, and then maybe most importantly to the group on this webinar is to produce a set of tools to guide cultural resources in fire management. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, feel free to email me. We're going to put together a website next month, and I can share that with this group maybe when I share the link to the recording. So stay tuned on that, and if you have any other questions, please go ahead and type them. It looks like some people are signing off. Brad Anderson just asked if there's access to the PowerPoint. At the very least, the recording of the webinar will have the slides on it, and I'll work with Kevin and find out if he can share maybe a PDF version of the PowerPoint itself that we could post in some shape or form.
No problem.
Oh, okay, great. Good. That makes it easy. Thanks, Kevin. So let's see. Any other questions out there? I'm looking in the chat window. There's nothing that's coming immediately. Maybe I'll try again to unmute the line here. Other questions out there? It sounds, Kevin, like you're off the hook, but again, I want to thank you. That was a really great presentation, great introduction, and I think for many of us, even if we know about one portion of what you talked about, there are other parts of it that were new and interesting. So I appreciate your time, and I think it looks like we've dealt with most of the immediate questions, so we'll go ahead and sign off this webinar. Okay. Unless you had any last comments, Kevin.
Yeah, just to you. Can you just take the copy you've got and convert it to a PDF?
Sure thing. Sure thing. I'll go ahead and do that.
Yeah, go ahead and do that, and then we won't squeeze the phone lines for anything else.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for participating, and thank you again, Kevin. I'll go ahead and turn off the phone line and dismiss the participants.
Okay. Take care. Good luck to everybody.